We're going to start out our discussion of language endangerment, language documentation, and language revitalization by focusing today on some of the big picture issues, the causes, why we care about it, and just how big and how widespread of an issue it really is. We'll also take a look specifically at what I mean when I say documentary linguistics, which is a kind of newly formed subfield or a newly forming subfield over the last 20 years or so within our field of linguistics. But first I want to sort of humanize this by starting with a story. Right here, this is my friend Howard Kimawan, and what he's doing is stripping birch bark for a canoe in this picture.
I used to go get it from my grandma, my parents, my mother especially. She used a lot of that. And I did the hard part. I harvested. Harvest yet? It's still too cold out. This is what it looks like this time of the year. It's not ready yet to be harvested.
He's a fluent speaker of Ojibwe, and he goes around the country and around the state, especially doing the sorts of things you just saw him do in this video. When he was a kid, everyone spoke Ojibwe where he was from. Now, most of the people who were kids don't speak it anymore. And the people who do speak it are getting older, and they're dying. So what's going to happen to his language? And what did happen to the language? Well, a lot of things happened. Part of it was economic, in a sense. There were traditional ways of being that involved the language, and a couple of hundred years ago, the fur trade came around. That's a whole other story of history that we'll talk through maybe a little more, but it's maybe best left for your history class. One thing we should definitely mention is that this didn't just happen in a vacuum. It wasn't just economy. There were policies and laws that made it illegal for people like Howard to speak his language, for him to practice his religion, up until the 1970s. And also, there were boarding schools. Many people that Howard knew went to some sort of residential or long-term school where they were abused for speaking the language. They were beaten as kids. Those things happened to the language in order to make it so that most kids nowadays in his community don't speak it, whereas they did only a couple of decades ago. One thing we should try to address first is the sort of who cares problem. Occasionally people say, well, maybe that's sad, but maybe it's inevitable, or maybe linguists shouldn't care so much about it. It's certainly the case, however, that indigenous people care about language revitalization and language documentation because language is a really important piece of your identity. That's what we're arguing when we're talking about sociolinguistics and sociocultural linguistics. And it's true for English, and it's just as true for the indigenous languages of the world. Also, these languages carry knowledge. They carry traditional historical knowledge along with them. Religion, history, the movement of people. All these things are encoded in the language and in the myth and in the story. There's also some evidence that communities that have their language, that still speak their native language, fare better on certain health metrics. So indigenous people are certainly aware of this and certainly care about their language. Linguists also recognize the value of the knowledge, but it's just so important for us as researchers to have the language data, right? If nothing else, the more languages we have, the more research that we can do about what's possible in human language. Sometimes you'll hear people ask, well, isn't it a good thing for there to be less languages? Won't people be less confused that way? And I think it's really important that linguists made a decision in the 80s and 90s to use this endangerment rhetoric. Because really, this loss of diversity has huge consequences. And it's also important to note that we as humans have the ability to learn a bunch of languages. You could learn 2, 3, 4 languages if you put the time into it, if you needed to. And people who learn more languages, there tend to be cognitive benefits alongside that. So it's not the case that we just have to learn one language. People learn more than one language all the time. Some people will also occasionally argue, well, there should only be one world language, that it would help us all get along more, that we would all be more nationalist together if we all spoke a single language. But it's not possible. There will never be just one world language. Languages change. And, of course, as I like to point out, there's a really good example to the contrary. But what do I mean when I say language endangerment? An endangered language is a language that's likely to soon become, well, not spoken anymore. There are a bunch of terms that we use to describe a language that's not spoken anymore. We especially used to call these languages dead or extinct. So when the last native speaker of a language dies and the language isn't spoken by anyone anymore as a first language, we consider that language to be dead or extinct. But as a field, many people consider these words to be kind of offensive and inaccurate, because a dead language can be brought back if someone decides to learn it and pass it on to their kids. That's a lot different than a T-Rex, which is well and truly gone, Jurassic Park notwithstanding. So we like to call languages dormant. A dormant language or sleeping language is a language that's not spoken by anyone anymore as a first language, but it's there and it's ready to be brought back. We'll talk more about revitalization next time. Languages, as we hinted, become endangered in a lot of ways, but it's really important for us to really explicitly mark whose languages become endangered. Minority peoples have endangered languages. Marginalized peoples have endangered languages. English isn't going to be endangered anytime soon. Outside forces have to play a role in language endangerment. These aren't things that just happen naturally and randomly. They happen when people stop speaking to each other in a language. And what would it take for you to stop speaking English to each other? What would it take for you to stop speaking English to your kid? That's what happens for a language to become endangered. On the extreme side of the scale, now this isn't out of the ordinary. It does happen, but it is on the extreme side. Sometimes languages become endangered because of genocide. In Tasmania, there was a language spoken on the Tasmanian island off of Australia in the 1800s. Those languages are almost entirely dormant now because of mass genocide by Englishmen and Australians who wanted the land there. And we'll talk more about the Wiyot. The Wiyot is an Algonquian language, so it's a language that's related to speakers out here in the Great Lakes, but it's spoken in California. We'll have a lot more to tell about that story later. As we've mentioned many times, there are over 6,000 languages in the world. It's hard to count, something like 7 or 8. It can be tricky to count those. They're also, as we've mentioned, not evenly distributed around the globe. For instance, we see on this wonderful map here of the Northwest, only a few languages in the Great Basin relative to the plateau in the Northwest coast, where we see language all stacked up on top of each other. California, before Spaniards showed up, was one of the most diverse, populous places on this continent. According to Ethnologue, there are something like 7,000 world languages at the time that I checked this, and there was 230 of those languages spoken on the whole continent of Europe. On the island of Papua New Guinea, there are over 800 languages. Linguistic diversity around the world is not evenly distributed, and it is precarious. Because as we found out from our reading, something like half to 90% of the languages, those 7,000 languages, will be gone by the end of this century. When linguists heard this the first time in 1992, it absolutely shook us. What are we going to do to prevent this data if being just gone? If we, not even to put it in the human cost of the indigenous communities who are losing their languages, but if we as astronomers found out that 90% of the stars were going to burn out, that would be huge. So let's take a look at Michael Krause's numbers and try to update them. He gives a count for the EAC language in 1992 of having 2 speakers. I would update that count to 0. The last speaker, as far as I know, died in the 21st century, although there is a growing group of second language speakers. Mandan Krause in 1992 gave a count of 6. I would also update that to 0. According to the local paper, the Bismarck Tribune, the last speaker died in 2016. That might not be the resource you might go to first, but it can be really hard to get this kind of data, and oftentimes the big reliable encyclopedia's data is out of date by sometimes 10 or 15 or 20 years. The Osage language, Krause updated. I would update again to saying having about 0 speakers, but again a growing population of people learning the language from documentation and from tapes. Abenaki Penobscot, Krause listed as having about 20 speakers. I would list that as having somewhere between 0 and 5 speakers, but that's probably closer to 0 now. 2006 was about 15 years ago. Yakutsk in 1992, Krauss listed as having under 10 speakers, but nowadays if you look at some of the sources, you'll see something like 3 or 4 dozen speakers, maybe 50 speakers. Well, some of those counts are counting people who we would call semi-speakers or rememberers, people who know a lot of the language but aren't fluent per se. What does fluent mean? We get into some complicated arguments there. One language that I have personal experience with is the Menominee language. My advisor, Monica McCauley, worked on that language for many years. And while Krauss said in 1992 that there were under 50 speakers, 50 was on the generous side even for that. A couple of years later, there were far, far fewer. Right now, I would say there's probably 0 fluent speakers of the language left, but a handful of people who remember a lot and who know a lot of the language. It becomes difficult to measure language endangerment too, because raw speaker numbers like the numbers we just gave can be misleading. Who counts? How do we make those decisions? But also a low number of speakers can be stable for many, many years. And a relatively high number of speakers could obscure demographic trends that a more fine-grained kind of analysis could catch. For instance, if there's 5,000 speakers, 50,000 speakers, but they're all over the age of 50, that's a time bomb. The UNESCO scale sort of ranks languages from 0 to 5, 0 being extinct or dormant, and 5 being a safe language. It's based on a number of different intersecting factors. So here we're talking about intergenerational transmission. Are children using the language? What is the age of the youngest person using the language? Linguists, as we'll talk about a little more next time, can help in a number of different ways. For instance, all linguistics is descriptive as opposed to prescriptive. We don't like to tell people what to do and what to say, typically. However, within linguistics, there are some of us who are more descriptive than others. Some of us believe in just describing the data and putting it out there for other people to use as they wish, and some linguists are more theoretical. They want to try to make the sort of physics of language or the sort of mathematics of grammar pop out. That's the sort of difference between asking, how can I describe language in general versus how can I describe this language in this moment with these speakers? That's what I would call documentary linguistics, or language documentation. Documentary linguistics is the subfield of linguistics that focuses all on those sort of practical data questions. It's the making of records, the keeping of records, and how we use records on the world's languages. Topics in this field include, what does it even mean to document a language? You find when you start looking at the world's languages that data has been scratched out on napkins to entered into complex databases and everything in between. How do we create that documentation? Is it using some of the complex recording equipment that I've now used in a different way to create this digital lecture? Or do we create language documentation in lower tech ways? Who gets to see that language documentation? Who gets to own it? Who is a subject and who is the object of research? All these ethical and philosophical and legal issues are very important in documentary linguistics. In the old school perspective, there were 3 big pieces of language documentation that you needed. Language documentation was a grammar to tell you how the sentences work, a dictionary to tell you what words to put in the sentences, and stories to give you examples of the sentences to use in your grammar and your dictionary. We call this the Boasian trilogy, after Franz Boas, who we've talked about a little bit before. Nowadays, we view this task much more broadly. So it's not just the grammar for linguists, the dictionary for linguists, the book of stories for linguists. Undocumented and underdocumented languages have way too much awesome information to just be wasted on linguists. There's all sorts of brilliant nuggets that come out in conversations that don't make it into papers. It's really important to note how technology has driven documentation at every step of the way for 150 years. 100 years ago, language documentation was radically improved, drastically improved by recording devices like phonographs, things that we would now consider to be bulky and unreliable. Nowadays, where we can just record endless hours, the game has completely changed. Another really important piece of this, and I've sort of mentioned it before, is the multiple audiences of language documentation. Linguists on the one hand we want example sentences, example words. We need to get tenure and to get academic jobs and to write papers and to write dissertations and to publish books. The communities want all sorts of different things. Some communities want more native speakers. Some communities want to have storytelling events. Some communities want to bring back their language so that they can have prayers in it. So there's so many different audiences with different needs for language documentation, and they all have different demands. They want the data to be friendly for their purposes. Who are we doing this research for? These are really concrete questions. So for instance, let's say you wanted to create a dictionary. Simple, right? Dictionaries are just products of linguistic research. So you just do some research and then you produce a dictionary. But how do you write the dictionary? What spelling system do you use? How do you spell the words? Who gets last decision rights on spelling those words? Which vocabulary gets included in the dictionary? Which vocabulary gets excluded from the dictionary? And 1,000 more questions. Ask me about these. I have practical experience. In summary, there's at the low end looking at 3,000 languages disappearing over the course of this century. These are the unevenly distributed languages around the world of mostly colonized places and minority peoples. Documentary linguistics is that subfield that was founded about 20 years ago, actually, that's designed to focus on the data, on the foundations of language data that we all work with. And when we say how and why do languages die, well, typically it's because the speakers died and the children didn't pick it up. We talked about the UNESCO scale earlier. We can see that there's a number of different axes that we can measure language documentation on, not just absolute number of speakers, but also intergenerational transmission. What are people's attitudes toward the language? Do they consider it to be the language of modern times, of fashion, of commerce, or do they consider it to be only of religion, or do they consider it to be whatever? Where are people allowed to use it? Are they allowed to use it in schools? Are they allowed to use it in churches? Is it being banned? All sorts of these questions and a complex social and cultural analysis have to follow there. Next time we're going to talk about how to bring it back.